when I grew up, I wanted to be like a film director. I kept doing lots of different stuff. So I was like editing. I was like doing corporate videos. I was like a headshot photographer a bit, and I just pick one thing, do it for 5 years, like make that your focus and see where it goes. And writing was the very first thing that, when I was a kid, I'd sit on the kitchen table and just like write short stories and stuff. And so it's like, well, that's your first love. See where that takes you. See how you can destroy it for profit. And that's what I ended up doing. I think like on that question specifically was me asking, both myself as a young man, thinking about my future, and also looking at my grandparents' relationship and going, the idea of what love looks like is different, obviously, in an arranged marriage, but also there is totally love there, and it's different to what I'd seen on like films or in plays or anything else, because it has such a very specific thing. It was like you are basically thrown together. Something about that I found quite exhilarating, actually, in a way, and I was trying to imagine myself being them and young in 1950s India and go, how can I make people look at what an arranged marriage is in a different way? And so I found that quite an exciting challenge just to start off, and then just who those characters are, just to, the scene when you see them come together, that to be the slingshot that fires you through a whole 60 years, rather than just being this sort of relatively drab, loveless thing. It's like, what's the love in that? And I think that's quite unexpected. So with an adventure, like I got commissioned on this, was it end of 2015? I handed in a first draft end of 2016 because I had some other stuff to do, like Murdered by My Father. And what that meant was I had a lot of time to really dig into what that was. There was a lot of historical research to be done there. So I was like, okay, the research here is super important, and I need to absorb some of that before I set out really to write much about it. Like I'd written a couple of scraps of things, but to really get into it, I felt like I needed to come from a place of a bit more knowledge. Writing for experience is useful, but more write what you want to know is better, because it means you come into the work with a question. Because I think if you come into something when you're like settled on what that is, that makes for quite a dull piece of drama. But if you're like, I don't quite know what that is, and I would like to push into that, and then you make yourself know it, I think that's both interesting for you as a process, but also exhilarating eventually for an audience. So like with an adventure, there's loads of stuff that I thought I knew, but I didn't quite know. And like pushing myself to do that has, it's like broadened my mind, but also I think it means I've created a much more solid piece of work that sort of respects the place where it's coming from. So I think with television, there are certain things that you can do better than you can in theatre. So like with Murdered by My Father, I've seen some plays around honour violence, but for me, the most useful place for that story felt like television, because it felt like that's something lots more people need to understand, and like they use it for like training police sometimes now, which is great, and because it means that acts as a permanent thing in the world, and people can see it. It can find a much broader audience than people who will go see a play. But what's really lovely about theatre, and I think writing lots of TV makes you more appreciative about theatre, is how you can create your own little world in this tiny space, and how you really push people to imagine things. The thing that TV has been really good at teaching me is to be really brutal about stuff. And I think when I first started writing, especially theatre, I was like, God, that was so hard. Like, I just don't want to touch that again. And, like, the idea of like scrapping something and starting again, like, terrifies me. But like I rewrote a television project from scratch 2 months out from shooting, and that was terrifying. And I was like, oh my God, what's this going to look like? But then having done it, and then having done it a couple of times, like, actually that came out great every time I did it, because again, you've come to that point where you know everything about it now, and it's like, clear it out and start again. So it is, the writer's block thing is the only way through it, is to just write something and to let yourself be a bit terrible with it, and trust the process of what you're doing, and knowing as long as you get it on the page, you can make it better. And I think like, it's both the most common piece of advice I think you give them, but also it's just the absolute truism, and the one that you hit again and again and again. And wherever I'm going like, oh my God, I don't know what to do with that. It's like, put something down, and then if your brain is in the right place, like, you will create something. So I think, like I say it to actors all the time, I think actors are the best writers, because they're trained with dealing with looping emotional arcs through the head again and again and again and again. And like, I think those through lines are sort of where most writers stumble. So I think there is that natural instinct of creating narrative, even if you don't necessarily think about it in that way. So from that, it's like, just do it. Like, you just have to sit down and and be both generous with yourself, but also like hard at the same time. And I think finding that balance is difficult. But the most useful thing for me, I think, when I was starting out, was finding a group of people I could share my work with, people who you feel understand what you're trying to do, and then can offer a view on it that's, you know, that you might, to give you something that you might have missed. But holding on to those people is the most useful thing, I think. So yeah, doing it, let yourself be terrible, be hard on yourself when you need to, find the people who help you make the work that you think the world deserves. So the play that I was writing, which is sort of like started, I had an attachment at the National at the end of last year, and I spent 6 weeks researching and starting to outline a play about George Lucas and Hollywood in the 1970s, and how it went from sort of new Hollywood, sort of punky indie aesthetic, to sort of new blockbusters led by talent, and how that changeover happens, but also just how he went from being an experimental filmmaker, which is named the play, to becoming the most populist filmmaker of all time, at a time when the world was very grey and there was a mad American president, and things are very familiar actually to today, how that creative thing happened for him. And I like premises that sound like a joke, and then just try and make them like the best thing you can ever make them. I think that's where I am now in terms of writing. It's like, I've done like my serious things and things I feel like are validating my family and things that are important to my community. What's the really silly thing that I think would be really fun to make? And that's sort of where I am at the moment.